What's good, my people? Welcome back to the channel. So this man now, who is an HRM of Orodje Of Okpe Kingdom, was once a VC during Peter Obi administration. And just like I always say, your good works will always speak for you, especially if you do the one that people appreciate and leave a good mark on their life. They will always want to tell good stories whenever they see you around. And this is exactly what happened when Peter Obi paid a visit to his kingdom about a week ago. Yes, it was such a pleasant moment for him to see Mr. Peter Obi in his palace, and he decided to shift a little out of the main aim of his coming, instead to give them a story about what Peter Obi did for him. Here's the video. Don't forget to subscribe.
In my lifetime, and my people cherish it so much. For people who don't know, let's play that program. As the Chancellor of Anambra University, now Dumeko University in Anambra State. So this is the photograph. To show that His Excellency Peter Obi is a paralyzed Nigerian. He didn't know me, he just mentioned my name and accepted me. I remember the very first time we went to, when I was to be installed. I went with a lot of my chiefs. There was one lady, and when we got there that evening, the dinner, His Excellency was serving people himself. Humility. He was serving you. He will serve you. And there was one of my female chiefs said that he has gone to heaven. That the governor serving food. So this is the type of person he is. So when we talk about labor movement, it is the person that is the labor movement, because what he did in Anambra State, the amount of money he left behind in the cost, no pure water. He has nobody. And that is, you see, so it shows that Nigerians, they like good things. They know good leaders. And this movement is of his death. And it is a prayer that the movement will not die in Jesus' name. So, Excellency, I want to thank you for allowing my subject, Taylor Bennett, under the movement, labor movement, to represent Okpe Sapele Federal Constituency in the House of Representatives. And when he told me that you'll be coming, I said, Obi is coming? Please, I will receive you if you will agree that. Let me just say thank you. It's an opportunity for me to say thank you for what he did to those people. That is the purpose of this reception. And we cannot forget what you did for us. And we appreciate you, Your Excellency. I appreciate you. We know your worth in this country, but God knows the best. Your Excellency, we appreciate you. We want to thank you for coming and for honoring my son. Because of him, you came all the way at Abuja to Lagos. Even to a different place where he lives at Uye, Efron. Even after that, they are even following to his village. What an honor. Because I was waiting for you here, because I was supposed to be in the church, the Thanksgiving. But I didn't know how the church. Now I had to send my Prime Minister to represent me here, there, where I'm waiting for you here. Your Excellency, once again, you are welcome. And we pray that your stay here will be peaceful and be protected, and you go back home safely. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for coming.
Okay. as Peter said, three very important arms of social contact for the Catholic faithful are represented essentially capturing the entire community. And the reason that we have those particular bodies is essentially for us to be able to articulate for the lay faithful to start with and all of society are ways that they engage in social, political, and economic action for the advance of the common good of all in society. And we do this significantly because we have a body, a corpus of knowledge, information that facilitates how we engage issues of society and the human person in society. If I may just, and I want to give this background as I think it's quite important. So this is not an isolation event. It's something that's part of a huge history. When the human community faced grave crisis during the Industrial Revolution, and society was really at a crossroads. Writers wrote novels like A Child of Two Cities, people like Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities, A Child of Two Worlds, all kinds of writings about those harrowing conditions in industrializing Europe when human beings were treated worse than chattels. The Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII, wrote an encyclical letter. It was titled Rerum Novarum. It was a response to how society could organize itself. Some left-inclined political scientists like Karl Marx and Engels had written, of course, the Communist Manifesto as a response to the challenge of those times. Well, beginning with Rerum Novarum, church fathers have provided us incredible body of teachings on social organization. But we have also had the privilege of church fathers who not only come from perspective of faith, but also from just rational engagement with social problems. Benedict XVI, before he became Pope, was one of the greatest philosophers in the world. As Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. And he once famously engaged in a huge debate in Germany that became legendary with one of the greatest philosophers, modern living philosophers, not of a church background, who is generally considered today the philosopher of the public sphere. If you want to talk about the public sphere, the philosopher that you talk about happens also to be German, just like Ratzinger was. And he is generally credited with a series of books and publications that essentially define modernity and democracy as coming together at that nexus of rational public conversation. And they were both engaged in this debate in which Cardinal Ratzinger was able to show that without even going to scripture, you can prove God and prove God's desire for society. And I think that also informs how we approach this discussion. We come at the conversations that we're going to have this afternoon from perspectives of people of faith, but we also come at it from the perspective of rational public conversation, creating a marketplace of ideas that then adds to how societies make progress. The second point that I'd like to make in this regard is that for a good part of my adult life, I've read the Book of Lamentations, not in the Bible, but by Nigerians. Nigerians are constantly lamenting why things are going bad, have gone from bad to worse and all of that. And I find a certain, I don't know what to call it, slothfulness that prevents us from asking, what is at the root of this? We just talk about the problems. Well, I think also there's a huge body of intellectual knowledge, and here I am, fortunately, I think, served well by my background as a political scientist, by my background as a policy economist. When I was in grad school, my head of department, Eleanor Lynn Ostrom, was engaged in a very important debate about how society makes progress. She would end up being the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, Eleanor Lynn Ostrom, at Indiana. And part of what made for her success as an intellectual was a perspective that she brought to the question of the tragedy of the commons. I mean, back in 1968, a famous marine biologist published an article that was titled "The Tragedy of the Commons," which looked at how people make choice in society and how those choices lead them to either progress or failure. Today, it's generally accepted in economics that the reason some countries succeed and others fail, the central reason are their institutions, the strength of their institutions. I mean, historians like Neil Ferguson, the British historian who wrote the book Civilization, the West versus the Rest, why Western countries have made more progress in terms of economic growth and the nature of their civilization, makes this point. Another version of that same book is Civilization, the 6 Killer Apps of Western Power. Economists, people who have won Nobel Prizes in economics, like Douglas North, whose major work is about institutions and human progress, have written volumes on all of this. But we watch our institutions ravaged, destroyed every day, and then we don't ask why. And tomorrow we go to the Book of Lamentations again about how we are not making progress as a country. There's also another perspective that values shape human progress. Many years ago, I was on sabbatical at the Harvard Business School writing a book titled Managing Uncertainty. So back in the mid-90s. And there was a colloquium at Harvard that was essentially titled, how values shape human progress. In fact, the book that came out of that colloquium was titled Culture Matters, How Values Shape Human Progress. That book was edited by Harrison and Huntington. So it is clear that amongst the many things that affect whether societies make progress or not are their values, there's the culture, and their institutions. Yet if you look at Nigeria, you will see that culture is in collapse. Our values are going the wrong direction. Our institutions are being damaged every day by politicians. And we ask ourselves, why is Nigeria struggling? Why is there poverty ravaging the land? I had personal privilege to write a book titled Why Nations Are Poor. And I made this point back in 2006 about why there is poverty in this land. It's not an accidental thing. It's a function of a failure of our institutions and the collapse of culture. And Barack Obama, first visit to Africa as an American president, made the point in that speech in Accra of what Africa needs: strong institutions, not strong men. But every day we see our institutions weakened. So let me summarize our joint understanding from both the Catholic laity, the Catholics in politics and business, and Catholic action in general. And I will have to read because it's a preferred text in that regard. And so, at this joint press briefing, I am honored on behalf of these three bodies to present a summary perspective. This conference statement is being issued jointly by the Catholics in Politics and this Business Leaders Forum, the Catholic Action Nigeria, and the Catholic Laity Council of Nigeria, in order to address pressing matters that have an impact on the well-being of all Nigerians. In many ways, we are at a crossroads in our lives as citizens and as a putative civilization. These times call for people of goodwill to exercise prophetic authority in civil society. It is to this duty that we gather with the spirit of the prophet Amos on social justice to address some grave present danger facing Nigeria and millions of people, God's children, whose destinies could be jeopardized without the assent of truth and justice in the situation we face in Nigeria today. Our approach to sounding a wake-up call draws from the social teachings of the Catholic Church, as I had indicated in my earlier preamble, and from a rational recognition of the fact that values shape human progress. Our approach, therefore, in this approach, we call on all people of goodwill, no matter the faith they profess, to share in this clarion call based on our shared humanity and the primacy of the dignity of the human person, whether they be Muslims, Christians, or animists for that matter. Amongst the issues to be addressed are the legitimacy challenges from disputed elections, now before tribunals, the plight of the people ravaged by poverty and burdened by public policy choices that seem to crush their will, especially the vulnerable and the weak, who, by the way, have a very special place in God's heart. And then, of course, the distractions, both at home and abroad, that have drawn decision makers in Nigeria away from the central issue of care for Nigerians who are suffering as they engage in adventures around the world and within that are almost irrelevant to the quality of life, the dignity of the people of Nigeria. This is why our prayers today include a call for impartiality, justice, and accountability from the Honorable Justices of the Presidential Elections Petition Tribunal. I mean, we all know how a certain pervasive feeling that justice doesn't happen in Nigeria has led to many people feeling despondent, but we want today to challenge that disposition. As representatives of Catholics in politics, industrialists, and the entire laity of the Catholic Church, we are here to remind the Honorable Justices that all eyes are on the judiciary and that the nation eagerly awaits their judgment on the presidential elections petitions that are before them. We implore the Honorable Justices to consider their role as safeguarding our democracy and to ensure that the verdict is not tainted by any external influences or personal biases. We emphasize the need for justice to prevail without fear or favor, guided solely by the principles of fairness and truth. We unequivocally state that Nigerians expect justice to be served in a manner that reflects the will of the people, and that the Honorable Justices should acknowledge the weight of their responsibilities and understand that their decision will shape the course of our nation's future. We also firmly believe that there won't be anarchy and heaven will not fall when a just and transparent judgment is served. In fact, the contrary is the case. The thing that will push us into anarchy is for injustice to prevail. And we have the prophets Amos and the history of the Jewish people to remind us of that. And so we strongly condemn in any form threats against the Honorable Justices in an attempt to influence judgment. And we want to send a clear message to politicians that no amount of threats or intimidations will weaken or intimidation will weaken the determination of Nigerians across ethnic and religious backgrounds who are united in their pursuit of a new Nigeria. Because that's something that is a matter of desperation, a new Nigeria. We urge our politicians to respect the integrity and independence of the judiciary and allow justice to be served without intervention. And we urge the Honorable Justices to recognize the historical significance of their decision as a fair and just judgment will emancipate Nigeria from its present hardships and burden of bad fiscal and monetary policies. On the hardships and economic challenges currently faced by the common people of Nigeria, we urge politicians across party lines to put aside party differences, collaborate in the best interest of the Nigerian people, and take swift and decisive action to address the prevailing economic crisis. We strongly condemn the holiday prayers in monetary values sent by the Senate President to the inbox of federal legislators. In a country where millions of our fellow citizens struggle to provide basic necessities for their families, it is distressing to witness our representatives indulging in such extravagant practices. It is disheartening, therefore, to witness these same legislators who have supported and endorsed policies that have exacerbated the hardships faced by our citizens now engaging in ostentatious displays of sharing our commonwealth in the form of prayers to their bank accounts. This clearly shows the disconnect between our lawmakers and the realities on the ground. The Nigerian people are not interested in empty gestures. Nigerian people clearly are not interested in empty gestures. They yearn for tangible actions that will alleviate their suffering and bring about real change. We call on the Senate President and federal legislators to show accountability and to immediately redirect their focus on policies and actions that address the pressing needs of our citizens. On the military junta in the Niger Republic, we call on ECOWAS heads of states to lend an attentive ear to the multitudes of voices that have expressed opposition to military intervention. We urge ECOWAS heads of states to recognize the importance of engaging with stakeholders who advocate for peace, reconciliation, and respect for the will of the Nigerian people. We call upon ECOWAS heads of states to leverage the diplomatic avenues at their disposal and engage in dialogue, mediation, and negotiation to find a way forward that is acceptable and truly represents the wishes of Nigerian citizens. Now is the time for them to demonstrate their commitment to values of regional cooperation, inclusivity, and respect for sovereignty. Dear friends, I want to thank you so very much for your kind attention and hope that we will be able to extend these thoughts to all Nigerians everywhere through you so that we may be engaged and rescue our country. The Caritas Nigeria, JDPC, were hugely invested, engaged in, as with other elections, election monitoring. They have published this huge report, the 2023 General Elections Observation Report in Nigeria. The European Union invested billions of naira in INEC, and they have published a report. I believe that Chatham House has its own report. If the waiting of the outcome of what the judges do contradict these reports, we have created a deep legitimacy crisis for any regime that comes out of it. And that is part of the point I was trying to make about understanding why countries don't make progress. May Nigeria continue to go forward, or it may continue to stumble and fumble, but you can tell where it is going. It's all the way south. It's going to be a failed state when the regime does not have legitimacy. I put on my political scientist hat now. One of the most remarkable books about the nature of democracy was written by an American political scientist called Seymour Martin Lipset. And book is titled The First New Nation. And he probes deeply into the concept of legitimacy. Legitimacy is earned every day. We can institutionally say a regime derives legitimacy from the ballot box and the announcement of the outcome of the count of the vote. But if in its conduct, a day after the election, it is not seen to act in the interest of the people, it goes through a vitiation of its legitimacy attributes. In fact and indeed, when your legitimacy becomes atrophied, you generally create a situation that leads to what political scientists refer to as the politics of power erosion. When a coup succeeds, it is because power erosion has traveled very far, because the regime they have replaced has significantly lost legitimacy. And this is what we will have to watch and deal with in Nigeria. It's not a matter of what we here think or even do. Somalia did not get to be Somalia by accident. It is because of the politics of power erosion following crisis of legitimacy. And then Somalia became a failed state in which warlords control several places. And what is going on in Nigeria here? We're encouraging thugs to have public authorities support because we think they are on our side of some political divide. That's how you create a delegitimization of the state and ultimately create warlords and reach the road to Somalia. We need to be careful of these things. This is why I make the point that you need to understand how countries have made progress and why they have failed through human history. And many of the things we're doing right now, essentially encouraging arriving at the destination of those countries that have failed. And citizens must rally to say, cannot go on like this. There are certain dignifying things to do. Thugs don't show up in the villa and give press conferences that divide their people. That is not done by any serious regime in the world. I think that is a matter in your domain as people who work in the marketplace of ideas. It's a public conversation subject. What is freedom of expression? What is abuse of the right of freedom of expression in a democracy? I incidentally had the privilege many years ago of being part of a U.S. International Visitors Program on the subject of freedom of expression. And amongst those who were on that team with me were Abike Dabiri and Senator Sani, Shehu Sani. It was several years ago before Shehu Sani became a senator. And the subject of freedom of expression is very, very fundamental to how democracies thrive. Surely your freedom stops where mine begins. But the nuances of what freedom of expression really is can make or break a democracy. And that is a clear example. I mean, I don't know who are the people putting up the signs, but they can argue their constitutional rights to express themselves one way or the other. Or should we arrest the person who said anarchy will follow a certain kind of decision? Should we knock down his statement? All those are issues on freedom of expression. And we ought to put all of these together in how we look at this collapse of culture that we talk about and whether the prospects of democracy in Nigeria can be, if you will, considered safe and good. In the 1970s, I think around 77 or thereabouts, I was with a group of Ethiopian and Somali friends, and we went to a nightclub in London. We were, I think the day or so before that suddenly Somalia became a US client and Ethiopia became an East Bloc client. It used to be the other way around. I think Mangitu Haile Mariam had taken over in Ethiopia, and he decided to turn to Eric Honecker and East Germans for support. And Ethiopia, which had been an American client state, suddenly was on the Marxist side, and Somalis had to then be adopted by the Americans as their new client. A number of tragedies in this story, besides the fact that one of the girls poured wine on me while they were pouring all kinds of things across the table at each other, the Ethiopians and the Somalis. But a really serious part of this is that Africa has gone full circle and we're back in the 1960s. We are back to being client states of countries. What came out of Africa's place during the so-called Cold War? Because Africa's decline, fall into poverty, and ultimately a concept emerged that was called Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism was an indication that Africa was a place of pessimism. In fact, an OECD study suggested that Africa was so irrelevant to the world. And somebody asked the question at the presentation of that OECD study, so what happens? And the person was cynical enough to say, if Africa were to drop out of the planet, nobody will notice. And that was the period when Time magazines, some of these magazines, had cover stories like the hopeless continent. Well, we seem to have recovered some from Afro-pessimism, but suddenly we seem to be winding ourselves back to client states and Afro-pessimism. And if the people who lead Africa are not intelligent enough to understand what is going on, and in their short-term hunger for personal legitimating attributes, they bring Africa back to where it was in the 1970s. The shame will be theirs forever. So we ought to understand history, understand where we are. It's much more than this was a big country and that is a small country. It's much more than that. In fact, there are friends of mine whose interpretation of what is going on is that the regimes of West Africa that are called democracies are illegitimate. They are far less democratic than one taken over by the military, because they have abused democracy by forcing people to pretend that they are a democracy, installing regimes that the people do not believe in, and calling those democracies. They are not democracies. I have held the view very strongly that Nigeria is not a democracy. And so if a group of soldiers overthrow a quasi-democracy, they might be doing a greater good to their people than what is happening in Nigeria. That's a personal view of mine. I expressed it strongly. And so this funny look, Alhassan Ouattara, president of Cote d'Ivoire, and myself, and Tidjane Thiam, who became minister of planning back in those days in Cote d'Ivoire, and Ablaise Ouedraogo, who was then deputy managing director of the WTO. 4 of us were walking down the lake in Annecy in France in 1996. Alhassan Ouattara was then deputy managing director of the IMF, when he said, suddenly during the course of our walk, that he was going to go back and run for president of Cote d'Ivoire. I immediately, all kinds of alarms blew up in my head. I knew where it was going. Well, as we all know, the French eventually installed him as president of Cote d'Ivoire. Savi Alhassan Ouattara is now running a third term. Is there a coup worse than that. But Hassan Ouattara is the one making the most noise about Niger. Africa needs to rethink how it acts in the interest of the African people. I'm currently writing a book that suggests that the conduct of African leaders today, if they are not careful, will mean 1,000 years of servitude for the black man. And we want to avoid that. Now, back in those days, they were quasi-authoritarian regimes. I'm not a supporter of authoritarian regimes. However, if you take the utilitarian view of the state, and you find that a bunch of criminals, and I've written a book that talks about the criminal hijack of politics in Nigeria. And the full title is Why Not? Citizenship, State Capture, Creeping Fascism, and the Criminal Hijack of Politics in Nigeria. If you take what is going on in many West African countries in the name of democracy, by God, I would rather that a group of soldiers are shooting at each other every day to see who will eventually... Look, let me even give you an example that I personally feel very strongly about. The way our National Assembly is carrying on. Can you reform that institution when they are the ones who will make the decisions on reform? You get to a point where the only way to do this thing is to press a reset button. I've never liked military rule. Military rule is particularly problematic because they are built on what I call negative legitimacy and the delegitimating of the previous order. No, look, you see, the concept of legitimacy says that nobody, whether he has all the guns in the world trained on people, can actually have power if he doesn't get some kind of acceptance, or they don't get some kind of acceptance from the people. And the way military regimes got their acceptance was to say in their coup broadcast, the hospitals have become consulting clinics, and people say, that's true, self. And then they get that legitimating attribute, and that allows them to govern. Many civilian regimes who actually convert the vote into an alternative gun to rob the people put themselves in a position where they're... Look, how many people are killed in the coups that take place in Nigeria? More are killed at elections. So if the dignity of the human person is the ultimate value, and more people get killed to get somebody to call himself elected, isn't it a lesser moral burden that maybe nobody is killed and some people... You know, back in those days in the 60s, the way the Latin Americans sorted that out, they didn't even go and shoot at night or do anything. They just said, look, General so-and-so, 6 divisions are loyal to him. You, General that, how many divisions you have loyal to you? 2. My friend, hand the presidential search to him. Are those the ideal forms? Democracy is a work in progress. But we cannot pretend that because the West says go to elections, that is a better form of deciding how you govern for the common good of all in the interest of the people.
We'll just take this last person and that's all, please.
Very often, we do not do enough to act on what we believe in. I'm sure many of you have seen a video that has gone viral, and I think it's a remarkable thing that is out. A professor who enters a classroom and says to some young lady, get out of my class. And she looks everywhere and she leaves. And then he asks the class, what just happened? What was it? They agreed it was not just. What did she do? But none of you did anything. The unfortunate thing is that ultimately somebody or everybody does something. But usually it is when it is too late. When I talk about fascism, and thank goodness I wrote this book before today, because I predicted 2023 4 years ago. Go and read the book. I talked about fascism and how it grows. You use bullying to win an election. You gain power through bullying. The next time you are further encouraged to bully. Go and look at Hitler's ascendance in the Weimar Republic in Germany. And the powerful, important statement credited to Reverend Martin Niemöller. So first, they came for the communists, and I said, I'm not a communist. Then they came for the Jews. Those Jews, they make wahala, Jerry. Then they came for the Catholics. I'm not going through the whole, I said, thank God I'm an Anglican. Finally, when they came for me, there was no one left to speak up. Now, the naked truth of the matter is that 25 years ago, an American called Robert Kaplan predicted the path we are traveling in the book, The Coming Anarchy. In looking at cleavages that are forming in West Africa, ethnic, religious, and so on and so forth, economic, and went as far as predicting that West Africa's descent into anarchy could start from a convergence of these cleavages in a city in Nigeria called Jos. I wrote about it, I shouted about it, I even formed an NGO called NUTRA, Nigerians United to Resist Anarchy. And we began to buy books to send to policymakers that points to these things. What has happened? Everything is predicted has happened. So people will act sometimes more rationally, like my group in NUTRA, sometimes ultimately by violently engaging the system. And that's when we all descend into anarchy. God forbid that be the path we travel.